What happens when a group of reckless bikers targets the wrong man? A seemingly unassuming farmer's son, fresh back from his deployment. They thought he was just another country boy with no fight left in him. What they didn't know was that Lucan Trainer wasn't just any man. He was a Navy SEAL, forged by years of intense training and hardened by battle. Beneath his quiet demeanor lay a warrior prepared to defend what mattered most. And when the Crimson Hounds crossed the line, they ignited a fight they would never forget. In this gripping tale of courage and resilience, we dive deep into a community torn by fear, a family pushed to the brink, and one man's relentless battle to protect his home and honor. It's a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat, reminding us all of the power of standing firm in the face of overwhelming odds. What are your thoughts on Lucan's story? We'd love to hear where you're watching from and what moments stood out most to you. Leave your insights in the comments below and let us know how this tale resonated with you. If you're ready for more inspiring stories, don't forget to subscribe to Heart Tales, turn on notifications so you never miss a video, and show some love by liking and sharing this story. Together, let's celebrate the strength and spirit that keep us moving forward. Enjoy the journey. This is Heart Tales. Lucan Trainer leaned against the worn wooden fence of his family's farm, his sharp blue eyes scanning the horizon. The sun dipped low, casting a warm golden glow over the sprawling fields of wheat swaying gently in the breeze. This was a sight he hadn't seen in years, not since his deployment as a Navy SEAL had taken him to the farthest corners of the world. The tranquility here seemed almost alien compared to the chaos and noise that had dominated his life. And yet, it wasn't enough to quiet the ghosts that still haunted him. He had returned home less than a week ago, trading the clamor of helicopters and gunfire for the chirping of crickets and the occasional hum of a distant tractor. His parents had greeted him with open arms, their faces lined with worry and relief. They hadn't asked much, only offering their love and a quiet space for him to readjust. But Lucan could see the unspoken questions in their eyes. What had he seen? What had he done? Was he okay? Lucan didn't have the answers. All he knew was that he had felt a pull, a need to come back to the place where his roots ran deep, to the farm that had been in his family for generations. He hoped the simplicity of this life could mend the fractures in his soul, though he wasn't naive enough to think it would be easy. The town of Millhaven was small, nestled in the heart of the Midwest. It had always been a quiet place, where everyone knew everyone and news traveled fast. As a boy, Lucan had spent his days racing through these fields and helping his father repair old machinery in the barn. It was a life of hard work and simple pleasures, one that had shaped the disciplined man he became. But now, as he stood there, he felt like a stranger in his own home. A low rumble pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see a battered pickup truck rolling down the dirt road toward the house. His father, Charles Trainer, stepped out, his movements slow and deliberate with age. The elder Trainer wiped his hands on a rag, his weathered face breaking into a smile when he saw Lucan. "Is the fence still holding up?" Charles asked, his voice gruff but warm. "For now," Lucan replied, managing a small smile. "But it could use some work." Charles nodded, his gaze lingering on his son. "Good to have you back, son. Farm's missed you." Lucan didn't respond, his throat tightening. Instead, he gestured toward the barn. "I'll get started on the tractor tomorrow. That old thing still giving you trouble?" "Always," Charles chuckled. "But we manage." As his father walked back to the house, Lucan remained by the fence, the weight of his return settling heavily on his shoulders. He had hoped for peace, but he knew it wouldn't come easily, not with the memories that clung to him, and certainly not with the looming presence of the Crimson Hounds. The Hounds were a local biker gang that had taken root in Millhaven during Lucan's absence. Their leader, Declan Forrester, was a brash and arrogant man with a penchant for causing trouble. Under his reign, the gang had transformed from a ragtag group of misfits into a well-organized force that extorted businesses, harassed locals, and claimed the roads as their own. Lucan had heard about them before he returned, but seeing their influence firsthand was a different story. At first, he had tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the work that needed to be done around the farm. But it wasn't long before their presence became impossible to overlook. He had seen them in town, their motorcycles roaring down the streets as they jeered at anyone who dared cross their path. He had heard the stories of shopkeepers forced to pay protection fees, of teenagers lured into their fold, and of those who had tried to stand up to them and paid the price. Lucan knew trouble when he saw it, and the Crimson Hounds reeked of it. But he hadn't come back to Millhaven to fight another war. He had come back to heal, to rebuild, and to find some semblance of normalcy. Confronting the Hounds would only stir up more chaos, and he wasn't sure he had the strength for it. For now, he told himself, he would stay out of their way. But deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before their paths crossed. The Millhaven Diner sat at the edge of town, a relic of simpler times with its red vinyl booths and a faded jukebox that hadn't worked in years. It was the kind of place where the air smelled like freshly brewed coffee and fried bacon, where the locals gathered to trade stories and gossip over stacks of pancakes. Lucan hadn't been back here since his teenage years, but today he found himself drawn to it, hoping for a brief reprieve from the thoughts that swirled in his head. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. A few heads turned, their eyes lighting up with recognition. There were murmurs of, "Welcome back," and "Good to see you, Lucan." But most of the patrons quickly returned to their conversations. He appreciated the subtlety. Small towns had a way of making everyone's business their own, but they also respected the space of those who needed it. Lucan slid into a corner booth, his back instinctively to the wall, a habit from years of always needing to know what was behind him. He ordered a black coffee and a plate of eggs from Mary, the elderly waitress who had worked here since he was a boy. She gave him a warm smile, though her eyes betrayed the same concern he had seen from so many others. He thanked her quietly and settled into the silence. The quiet didn't last long. The low growl of motorcycle engines echoed outside, growing louder until they roared to a stop in the diner's small parking lot. Lucan's jaw tightened as he recognized the unmistakable rumble of the Crimson Hounds. Moments later, the door swung open, and in strutted Declan Forrester, flanked by two of his cronies, Raven Thorne and Ivy Lindale. The air in the diner seemed to shift, a tangible tension spreading like wildfire. Declan's boots clunked heavily against the tiled floor as he made his way to the counter, his leather jacket creaking with each movement. His presence was magnetic, but not in a way that inspired admiration. Rather, it demanded attention, radiating arrogance and menace. "Morning, folks," Declan said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. He tossed a toothpick from his mouth onto the counter. "Lovely day, isn't it?" No one answered. The other patrons kept their heads down, their hands gripping their coffee mugs a little tighter. Even Mary, who had never let anyone intimidate her, seemed hesitant as she approached to take his order. Lucan stayed still, his eyes fixed on the steaming cup of coffee in front of him. He could feel Declan's gaze sweep over the room, lingering for a moment when it landed on him. The silence stretched thin. "Well, look who we've got here," Declan drawled, a grin spreading across his face as he sauntered over to Lucan's booth. "The hometown hero. Heard you've been back for a few days now, trainer. Welcome home." Lucan didn't look up. "Forrester," he said simply, his voice calm but carrying an edge. Declan slid into the seat across from him, ignoring the icy reception. Raven and Ivy leaned casually against the counter, their eyes darting between the two men like predators waiting for their cue to pounce. "You know," Declan continued, his grin never wavering, "we were just talking about how nice it is to have someone of your caliber back in town. A Navy SEAL, no less. Quite the big shot." Lucan met his gaze then, his expression unreadable. "If you're looking for a free meal, you're out of luck. Try working for it." A low chuckle escaped Declan's throat, but there was no humor in it. "That's the thing, trainer. You see, we've been doing a lot of work around here, keeping things running smoothly, making sure everyone stays safe. Maybe you've heard." Lucan's grip tightened around his coffee cup, but he didn't respond. He wasn't about to give Declan the satisfaction. "But you," Declan went on, leaning forward, "you've been gone so long I'm not sure you understand how things work around here anymore. This town's changed, trainer. And frankly, it doesn't seem like there's much room for a guy like you." The tension in the room was suffocating now, the other patrons frozen in place as they pretended not to listen. Lucan's silence only seemed to embolden Declan, who leaned back with a satisfied smirk. "Tell you what," Declan said, standing up and straightening his jacket. "Why don't you stick to your little farm and leave the rest to us? Wouldn't want you getting hurt now, would we?" He turned to leave, but not before grabbing Lucan's coffee mug and tossing it carelessly onto the table. The liquid splashed across the surface, pooling near the edge. Raven and Ivy followed him out, their laughter echoing through the diner as they mounted their bikes and roared away. The silence that followed was deafening. Lucan exhaled slowly, his jaw clenched tight. He reached for a napkin to clean up the mess, ignoring the stares of the other diners. Inside, however, a storm was brewing. It was only a matter of time. The days that followed the encounter at the diner were tense. Word traveled fast in Millhaven, and the locals spoke in hushed tones about the confrontation between Lucan Traynor and Declan Forrester. For most of them, the Crimson Hounds were an unshakable force, a group that had cemented its dominance through fear and coercion. Seeing someone stand up to Declan, even in silence, was a spark of defiance that few had dared to light. Lucan, however, kept his focus on the farm. Early mornings found him mending fences, tending to crops, or repairing the battered tractor that had seen better days. The physical labor was a welcome distraction, grounding him in routine and keeping the lingering memories of war at bay. But no amount of work could shake the feeling that trouble was brewing. It started subtly. One morning, as Lucan prepared to take a load of hay into town, he found the tires of his truck slashed, deep gouges rendering them useless. He didn't have to guess who was responsible. Later that week, the barn door was found ajar, the lock broken, and several tools missing. While none of these incidents were catastrophic, they carried a clear message. The Crimson Hounds weren't finished with him. Charles Traynor noticed the tension in his son. At dinner one evening, as they sat in the small kitchen with the soft hum of the radio in the background, he spoke up. "You've been quiet lately," Charles said, his voice measured. "Quieter than usual, even for you." Lucan looked up from his plate, his expression unreadable. "Just trying to keep things running," he replied. "There's a lot to do." Charles leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "I know that look, son. It's the same one you had when you decided to enlist. What's going on?" Lucan hesitated, the weight of his father's gaze heavy on him. "Finally," he sighed. "The hounds have been around making trouble. Nothing I can't handle." Charles frowned. "Trouble like what?" "Slashed tires? Missing tools? Just them trying to get under my skin," Lucan said, his voice steady but low. "That gang's been nothing but bad news since they rolled into town," Charles muttered, shaking his head. "But don't let them bait you, Lucan. You've fought bigger battles than this." Lucan gave a small nod, but his mind was elsewhere. He didn't want to worry his father, but he knew the situation was escalating. The Crimson Hounds weren't just trying to intimidate him. They were testing him, pushing to see how far they could go before he pushed back. The breaking point came one evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Lucan had just finished securing the barn for the night when he heard the rumble of engines in the distance. His heart sank as the noise grew louder, a pack of motorcycles roaring up the dirt road that led to the farm. He stepped out onto the porch, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The Crimson Hounds came into view, their headlights cutting through the twilight. Declan Forrester was at the front, his posture relaxed yet commanding as he brought his bike to a halt just a few yards from the house. Behind him, Raven Thorne and Ivy Lindale dismounted, their expressions smug and expectant. "Evening, Traynor," Declan called out, his voice carrying over the growl of the engines. "Thought we'd stop by and check in on you. You know, neighborly-like." Lucan didn't respond, his eyes narrowing as he watched them. He could see the glint of something in Declan's hand, a crowbar, casually swung at his side. "We've been hearing a lot about you," Declan continued, his tone mocking. "The big bad Navy SEAL, back to save the day. Real heroic stuff." "Get off my property," Lucan said evenly, his voice calm but firm. Declan chuckled, shaking his head. See, that's not very welcoming of you, trainer. We were hoping we could come to an understanding. What kind of understanding? Lucan asked, though he already knew the answer. Declan gestured toward the farm. This place, it's prime real estate, plenty of room for expansion. We could use it. Of course, we'd compensate you generously. Enough for you and your old man to retire somewhere nice and sunny. Not interested, Lucan replied, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Declan's smile faded, replaced by a cold, hard edge. That's a shame. It'd be easier for everyone if you just played along. But I get it. Some people have to learn the hard way. He took a step closer, his cronies following suit. The tension in the air was palpable, a thread stretched taut and ready to snap. Lucan stood his ground, his body coiled like a spring. He didn't want to fight. Not here. Not now. But he was ready if it came to that. Declan raised the crowbar, letting it dangle from his fingertips. You sure about this, trainer? Last chance. Lucan's response was simple. Get off my property. Now. For a moment it seemed like Declan might press the issue, but then he smirked, lowering the crowbar. All right, he said, backing away. We'll leave, for now. He turned to his crew, motioning for them to mount their bikes. But don't get too comfortable. We'll be seeing you around. As the hounds roared away into the night, Lucan exhaled slowly, his fists unclenching. He knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The following morning brought no relief. The faint traces of tire marks leading away from the farm were a grim reminder of the confrontation from the night before. Lucan spent the early hours patrolling the property, checking the fences and the barn for any signs of sabotage. Everything seemed intact for now, but the unease in his chest didn't fade. He knew the Crimson Hounds wouldn't stay quiet for long. His instincts proved correct later that afternoon when a neighbor, Ariadne Carrick, arrived in her beat-up truck, her face flushed with worry. Ariadne was one of the few people in Millhaven who wasn't afraid to speak her mind, a fact that had earned her both friends and enemies in equal measure. She had grown up alongside Lucan, and though their lives had taken vastly different paths, there was an unspoken bond of mutual respect between them. "Lucan," Ariadne called as she climbed out of the truck. "We need to talk." Lucan wiped his hands on a rag, stepping away from the tractor he had been working on. "What's going on?" Ariadne crossed her arms, her brow furrowed. "It's the hounds. They were in town this morning, making all kinds of threats. Declan's been running his mouth about you, saying you're trying to play hero and that it's going to cost everyone." Lucan's jaw tightened. What exactly did he say? Ariadne hesitated, glancing toward the house where Charles was sitting on the porch. She lowered her voice. "He said if you don't back off, he'll make sure your family pays for it. He's already told the shopkeepers in town to stop selling to you." Lucan's eyes darkened, the weight of her words sinking in. The Crimson Hounds weren't just targeting him. They were targeting anyone who might support him, isolating him in a way that was as insidious as it was effective. "I'm not going to let them scare me," Lucan said firmly. "I know you're not," Ariadne replied, her voice softening. "But you can't do this alone. Declan has the whole town wrapped around his finger. People are scared, Lucan. They'll do whatever it takes to avoid his wrath." Lucan looked away, his mind racing. He had spent his life standing up to bullies, but this was different. Declan wasn't just a bully. He was a manipulator, someone who thrived on exploiting fear and weakness. And while Lucan could handle threats against himself, the idea of his family or the townspeople being caught in the crossfire was unbearable. "I'll figure it out," he said finally. "Thanks for letting me know." Ariadne gave him a long look, her expression unreadable. "Just be careful, okay?" As she drove away, Lucan turned back to the house, his resolve hardening. If the Crimson Hounds wanted a fight, they were going to get one. That night, the hounds struck again. Lucan woke to the sound of barking dogs and the unmistakable crackle of flames. He was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the shotgun he kept by the door and rushing outside. The sight that greeted him was enough to make his blood boil. The barn was ablaze, the orange flames licking hungrily at the wooden structure. His father stood nearby, frantically trying to hose down the spreading fire. "Dad!" Lucan shouted, running to his side. "Are you okay?" Charles nodded, his face streaked with soot. "I'm fine. Just get the animals out." Lucan didn't hesitate, sprinting toward the barn and kicking open the doors. The heat was oppressive, but he pushed through, guiding the panicked livestock out one by one. By the time the last animal was safe, the fire had consumed half the structure, and there was nothing more they could do but watch it burn. As the fire died down in the early hours of the morning, exhaustion settled over Lucan like a heavy blanket. The barn was a total loss, but at least no lives had been lost. Still, the message was clear. The Crimson Hounds weren't going to stop until they had destroyed everything Lucan held dear. Charles sat on the porch, his shoulders slumped as he stared at the smoldering wreckage. "We can't keep going like this, son," he said quietly. "They'll ruin us." "They won't," Lucan replied, his voice steely. "I'll make sure of it." The next day, Lucan began to prepare. He spent hours scouring the woods behind the farm, setting up traps and scouting potential vantage points. His years as a SEAL had taught him the value of strategy, and he intended to use every ounce of that knowledge to protect his home. He didn't care if the hounds outnumbered him, or if they thought they were untouchable. They had crossed a line, and he wasn't going to let it slide. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He stopped periodically, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, but found nothing. Still, the unease lingered, a constant reminder that the Crimson Hounds were never far away. By nightfall, Lucan had fortified the property as best he could. The barn was gone, but the house and remaining structures were secure. He sat on the porch with his shotgun resting across his lap, his eyes trained on the dark expanse of the dirt road. He didn't know when the hounds would strike again, but he knew one thing for certain: he would be ready. The Crimson Hounds didn't wait long to make their next move. 2 days after the fire, Lucan received an unexpected visit at the farm. The sound of an approaching vehicle broke the stillness of the morning, and when he stepped out onto the porch, he saw a sleek black car pull up behind the gate. This wasn't one of the hounds' usual motorcycles, and that made Lucan wary. The driver's side door opened, and a man in a sharp suit stepped out, his movements deliberate and confident. He adjusted his tie as he approached the house, flashing a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Trainer," the man said, stopping just short of the porch. "My name is Silas Greylock. I'm here on behalf of Declan Forrester." Lucan crossed his arms, his gaze narrowing. If Declan has something to say, he can say it himself. Silas chuckled, unbothered by the hostility. "Declan prefers to avoid unnecessary confrontations. I, on the other hand, specialize in resolving misunderstandings." Lucan didn't respond, his silence an invitation for Silas to continue. "We're aware of the damage caused to your property," Silas said, gesturing toward the charred remains of the barn visible in the distance. "It's unfortunate, truly, but accidents happen. Wouldn't you agree?" Lucan's jaw tightened. "You call that an accident?" Silas held up a hand, his expression placating. "I'm not here to debate semantics, Mr. Trainer. I'm here to offer a solution. Declan is willing to overlook the tensions between you and his associates if you agree to a simple arrangement." Lucan raised an eyebrow. "And what arrangement would that be?" "Sell the farm," Silas said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Declan has connections with developers who are very interested in this land. They're willing to pay above market value, enough for you and your father to live comfortably elsewhere. It's a generous offer considering the circumstances." Lucan's lips curved into a humorless smile. "Generous, right." Silas's polite demeanor faltered for a moment, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "Think it over," he said, slipping a business card from his pocket and placing it on the porch railing. "But I'd advise against making this more difficult than it needs to be." He turned to leave, but Lucan's voice stopped him in his tracks. "Tell Declan," Lucan said, his tone cold, "that this farm isn't for sale, and if he wants a fight, he knows where to find me." Silas glanced back, his smile returning, though it was laced with condescension. "I'll pass along the message." As the black car disappeared down the dirt road, Lucan picked up the business card and studied it briefly, before crumpling it in his fist. The Crimson Hounds weren't going to back off, and he knew it. They were pushing him to his limits, hoping he'd break. But if they thought he'd roll over and surrender, they didn't know who they were dealing with. That evening, Lucan drove into town to stock up on supplies. The atmosphere at the general store was tense. The usual chatter and friendly greetings had been replaced by quiet murmurs and sidelong glances. The store clerk, a wiry man named Earl, greeted him with a strained smile. "Evening, Lucan," Earl said, ringing up the items on the counter. "Heard about the barn? Real sorry to hear that." "Thanks," Lucan replied, his tone clipped. He could tell Earl was holding something back. Earl hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "Look, I shouldn't be telling you this, but Declan's been spreading word around town. Says anyone who helps you is gonna regret it." Lucan's grip tightened on the counter. "Let me guess, he's threatening you too." Earl nodded reluctantly. "I've got kids, Lucan. I can't afford to cross him." Lucan exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain calm. "I get it, Earl. Just do what you have to do." As he left the store, his supplies packed in the bed of his truck, Lucan couldn't shake the weight of Earl's words. Declan's stranglehold on the town was suffocating, and it was clear that Lucan was running out of allies. If he was going to take the fight to the Crimson Hounds, he'd have to do it alone. The next night, Lucan prepared for the inevitable. He fortified the house, setting up makeshift barricades and positioning weapons strategically around the property. His years as a SEAL had taught him to anticipate every possibility, and he intended to be ready for whatever came his way. Around midnight, the familiar rumble of motorcycles broke the silence. Lucan stepped out onto the porch, his shotgun resting on his shoulder. The Crimson Hounds were back, their headlights cutting through the darkness as they rolled up to the house. Declan was at the front, flanked by Raven and Ivy, their faces shadowed, but their intentions clear. Declan dismounted, his boots crunching against the gravel as he approached. "Evening, trainer," he called out, his voice casual but laced with menace. "I see you've been busy, expecting company?" Lucan didn't respond, his eyes locked on Declan. The tension in the air was thick, the kind that made even the crickets fall silent. Declan smirked, gesturing to his crew. "Well, boys and girls, looks like our friend here is in the mood for a little party. Let's not disappoint him." As the hounds began to fan out, Lucan's grip on the shotgun tightened. The storm was about to break, and he was ready to face it head-on. Lucan didn't wait for them to make the first move. As Declan barked orders to his crew, Lucan slipped back inside the house, locking the door behind him. The adrenaline pumping through his veins sharpened his focus, his mind racing through the strategies he had rehearsed. He wasn't going to let them dictate the terms of this fight. The first sound of breaking glass came from the rear of the house. Raventhorn had smashed a window with a crowbar, her silhouette outlined by the dim moonlight as she climbed inside. Lucan was waiting for her. Before she could fully enter, he swung a metal rod with precision, knocking the crowbar from her grasp and sending her stumbling backward. She cursed loudly, retreating through the broken window. "First warning," Lucan muttered under his breath, gripping the rod tightly. The sound of footsteps on the porch told him that more were coming. He moved quickly, cutting through the house to intercept another intruder. Ivy Lindale was at the front door, her boots slamming against the wood in an attempt to force it open. Lucan steadied himself behind the door, and as it gave way, he delivered a calculated shove, sending her sprawling onto the porch. She hit the ground with a grunt, but before she could recover, Lucan had slammed the door shut again. Outside, Declan's frustration was palpable. "Get in there, you idiots!" he shouted, his voice echoing through the night. "He's just one man." But Lucan wasn't just a man. He was a Navy SEAL, trained for moments like this, where precision and discipline outweighed brute force. The standoff escalated as more of the hounds surrounded the house. Firecrackers and smoke bombs were thrown through the windows, their bright flashes and acrid smoke designed to disorient and intimidate. Lucan coughed as the smoke filled the living room, his eyes stinging as he moved toward the back of the house. His father's voice called out from the hallway. "Lucan, what's happening?" "Stay in your room, Dad," Lucan ordered, his voice firm. "Don't come out until I say it's safe." Charles nodded, retreating into the safety of his locked room. Lucan knew he had to end this quickly before the situation spiraled further out of control. The sound of a motorcycle engine revving caught his attention. Declan had mounted his bike, its headlights trained directly on the front porch. With a loud roar, he accelerated, charging toward the house. Lucan darted to the side just as the bike crashed into the porch railing, splintering wood and sending debris flying. Declan leaped off the bike, his boots hitting the ground with a thud. His face was twisted in fury as he pulled a knife from his belt, stalking toward Lucan with predatory intent. "You've had this coming, trainer," Declan snarled, brandishing the blade. "You should have stayed in your lane." Lucan didn't waste words. As Declan lunged, he sidestepped smoothly, using the momentum to grab Declan's wrist and twist it sharply. The knife clattered to the ground, but Declan wasn't finished. He swung wildly, his fist connecting with Lucan's side. The impact was strong, but Lucan absorbed the blow, retaliating with a well-placed elbow to Declan's jaw. Declan stumbled back, clutching his face. "You think you're better than me?" he spat, blood dripping from his lip. "You're nothing but a washed-up soldier playing farmer." Lucan's eyes blazed with fury. "And you're a coward hiding behind your gang." Meanwhile, the remaining hounds weren't idle. Raven and Ivy regrouped, coordinating their efforts to breach the house. They stormed through the back door, their weapons raised. Lucan saw them coming and moved quickly, grabbing a heavy chair and using it as a makeshift shield. He charged at them, the force knocking both women off balance. Ivy hit the ground hard, her weapon skittering across the floor, while Raven managed to stay on her feet, swinging a bat in a wide arc. Lucan ducked just in time, the bat whistling past his head. He countered with a swift kick to Raven's knee, sending her crashing to the ground. Before she could recover, he secured her hands with the length of rope he had stashed earlier. "You're done," Lucan said coldly, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. Ivy, realizing the tide had turned, scrambled to her feet and bolted toward the door. Lucan didn't pursue her, instead turning his attention back to Declan, who was picking himself up off the ground. Declan's bravado was fading, replaced by a flicker of fear. "This isn't over, trainer," he growled, backing away. "You don't know who you're messing with." Lucan advanced on him, his expression calm but unyielding. "You're right. I don't know you, and I don't care to." Declan's retreat was cut short as the distant wail of sirens reached their ears. Someone, perhaps Ariadne, or another brave soul in the town, had called the sheriff. The sound seemed to drain the fight out of Declan, who cursed under his breath and gestured for his remaining crew to fall back. "This isn't over," Declan hissed one last time before disappearing into the shadows with the remnants of his gang. Lucan stood on the porch, watching as the hounds fled into the night. His body ached from the fight, but he felt a grim sense of satisfaction. For now, the farm was safe, but he knew the battle was far from over. As the sheriff's cruiser pulled up to the farm, the flashing red and blue lights illuminated the aftermath of the battle. Lucan stood in the middle of the chaos, his shirt torn and smeared with dirt, his chest rising and falling with the effort to catch his breath. Around him lay the evidence of the Crimson Hound's attack: shattered wood, scattered debris, and the smoldering remains of Declan's wrecked motorcycle. Sheriff Martin Hayes stepped out of the car, his stern face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He surveyed the scene, his jaw tightening as he approached Lucan. "What the hell happened here, trainer?" Lucan leaned against the porch railing, his grip on the shotgun loosening. Declan Forrester and his gang decided to pay a visit. Martin sighed, running a hand over his face. "I warned you, Lucan. Getting involved with these guys was only going to make things worse." "I didn't get involved," Lucan said, his tone clipped. "They brought the fight to me." The sheriff glanced at the restrained Raventhorn, who glared up at him from her position on the ground. "And what about her?" "She broke in," Lucan replied. "I subdued her before she could do any real damage." Martin crouched down, his eyes narrowing as he addressed Raven. "You've got some nerve pulling a stunt like this." Raven smirked, her lip curling in defiance. You think locking me up is going to change anything? Declan doesn't care about me. He'll be back, and next time he won't leave anyone standing." Lucan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He already knew that Declan wasn't the type to back down. The hound's retreat was a temporary reprieve, not a victory. Martin straightened, gesturing to the 2 deputies who had arrived with him. "Get her in the car. We'll deal with her at the station." As Raven was hauled away, Martin turned back to Lucan. "You've got to be careful, son. Declan's going to take this personally, and when he comes back, he's not going to hold back." "I know," Lucan said simply. Martin studied him for a moment, then nodded. "We'll increase patrols in the area, but you need to be ready. This isn't over." The next few days passed in a tense haze. Lucan worked tirelessly to repair the damage to the farm, his father helping where he could despite his age. Ariadne stopped by often, bringing food and supplies, her presence a small comfort in the midst of the storm. "You should leave, Lucan," she said one evening as they sat on the porch. "Just for a while. Give Declan time to cool off." Lucan shook his head. "If I leave, they win. This farm is all my dad has left. I'm not going to let them take it from him." Ariadne sighed, her frustration evident. "You're stubborn, you know that?" "Comes with the territory," Lucan replied, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Despite his outward calm, Lucan knew the next attack was inevitable. Declan wouldn't let this go, and Lucan had no intention of giving him the upper hand. He spent his nights preparing, mapping out strategies, and setting traps around the property. The skills he had honed as a SEAL were second nature, and he used them to turn the farm into a fortress. The attack came at dawn, just as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon. Lucan was already awake, his senses attuned to the faint rumble of engines in the distance. He moved quickly, waking his father and guiding him to the reinforced basement. "Stay here," he instructed. "No matter what happens, don't come out until I say it's safe." Charles nodded, his face pale but determined. "You be careful, son." Lucan grabbed his weapons, a shotgun and a sidearm, and positioned himself near the front of the house. The Crimson Hounds arrived in force, their motorcycles kicking up clouds of dust as they sped down the dirt road. Declan was at the front, his face twisted in a mask of rage, flanked by Ivy Lindale and several other members of the gang. "Trainer!" Declan shouted, his voice carrying over the roar of the bikes. "You think you can humiliate me and get away with it? Think again." Lucan stepped onto the porch, his expression calm but resolute. "You should have walked away, Declan. This ends now." The gang dismounted, spreading out in a semicircle around the house. Declan's eyes gleamed with malice as he raised his hand, signaling the attack. The hounds moved as one, their weapons drawn, charging toward the house. Lucan didn't hesitate. He fired the first shot, a warning blast that scattered the front ranks and forced them to take cover. The traps he had set earlier sprang into action. Spikes hidden in the tall grass punctured tires, while tripwires sent several attackers sprawling. Ivy managed to dodge the initial chaos, her sharp reflexes carrying her to the side of the house. She crouched low, her eyes scanning for an opening. Spotting Lucan in the doorway, she raised her weapon. But before she could fire, a shot rang out from the tree line. Ariadne stepped into view, her hunting rifle steady as she advanced. "Told you I wouldn't let you do this alone," she called out, her voice firm. Lucan nodded in gratitude, his focus never wavering from the fight. Together, they pushed back against the onslaught, their combined efforts creating a wall of resistance that the hounds couldn't break. Declan, however, wasn't so easily deterred. He barked orders, rallying his crew for another push. This time, they focused their attack on the barn, hoping to draw Lucan and Ariadne out of their defensive positions. Declan's gang swarmed the barn like a pack of wolves, smashing through the doors with bats and crowbars. The old structure groaned under the assault, its timbers cracking as they worked to force Lucan out. From his position near the house, Lucan's sharp eyes tracked their movements, assessing their strategy. They were trying to divide his attention, draw him out of his fortified position into open combat, where they believed they'd have the upper hand. But Lucan wasn't about to fall into their trap. He gestured to Ariadne, who crouched behind a stack of hay bales near the tree line. "Cover the left flank," he said. "Don't let them regroup." Ariadne nodded, repositioning herself with precision. Her hunting rifle barked once, the sound cutting through the chaos as one of Declan's men dropped to the ground, clutching his leg. The gang hesitated, their momentum faltering as they realized they were being outmaneuvered. Declan, however, wasn't one to back down. He stood in the center of the barnyard, his face twisted with fury as he barked orders. "Keep pushing. He can't hold us all off." Lucan moved swiftly, using the shadows of the early morning to his advantage. He circled around the side of the house, staying low as he approached the barn. His shotgun was slung over his shoulder, and in his hand, he carried a crowbar. Silent, effective, and deadly in close quarters. Inside the barn, Ivy Lindale was attempting to set a makeshift fire, her hands fumbling with a lighter as she tried to ignite a pile of hay. Lucan slipped in through a side door, his movements soundless as he approached. The faint click of the lighter was the only warning she got before Lucan grabbed her wrist, twisting it sharply and forcing her to drop the flame. "You picked the wrong fight," he said, his voice low and menacing. Ivy snarled, lashing out with her free hand, but Lucan deflected the blow easily. He drove her back against the wall, pinning her in place with the crowbar pressed against her chest. "Call them off," he demanded. "Go to hell!" she spat, her eyes blazing with defiance. Lucan's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the barn door was kicked open, and Declan stormed in, his gun drawn. "Let her go, trainer," he growled, his finger hovering over the trigger. Lucan didn't flinch. "You've already lost, Declan. Your crew's falling apart, and you know it." Declan's laugh was sharp and bitter. "You think this is over? You've got no idea who you're messing with." "Neither do you," Lucan replied. In one swift motion, he released Ivy and lunged to the side, using the barn's support beam as cover. Declan's shot rang out, the bullet splintering wood inches from Lucan's head. The two men circled each other, the barn their battleground. Declan was aggressive, firing wildly in an attempt to corner Lucan, but his rage made him sloppy. Lucan, on the other hand, was calm and methodical, waiting for the perfect opening. When it came, it was decisive. Declan overextended, his arms swinging wide as he attempted to pistol whip Lucan. Seizing the moment, Lucan stepped inside his guard, disarming him with a sharp twist of the wrist. The gun clattered to the ground, and Lucan followed up with a devastating elbow to Declan's ribs. Declan staggered, gasping for breath, but he wasn't finished yet. He swung blindly, his fists wild with desperation. Lucan dodged each blow with precision, his movements fluid and controlled. When Declan finally overcommitted, Lucan delivered a crushing uppercut that sent him crashing to the ground. As Declan lay sprawled in the dirt, groaning in pain, Lucan stood over him, his chest heaving. "This is your last chance," Lucan said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "Walk away. Leave this town and never come back." Declan glared up at him, his eyes filled with hatred, but he didn't reply. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the tension, and moments later, the sheriff's deputies stormed onto the scene, weapons drawn. "Hands where I can see them," one of the deputies shouted. Lucan stepped back, raising his hands as Declan was dragged to his feet and handcuffed. Ivy and the remaining gang members were rounded up as well, their faces a mix of defiance and defeat. Sheriff Martin Hayes approached Lucan, his expression a blend of relief and frustration. "You all right?" he asked. Lucan nodded. "I'm fine. The farm's intact. That's what matters." Martin sighed, shaking his head. "You're lucky it didn't go worse. Declan's crew won't be back. Not after this. But next time, let us handle it." "There won't be a next time," Lucan replied firmly. "Not with them." Martin didn't argue, instead clapping Lucan on the shoulder. "You did good, son. Real good." As the sun rose higher, casting its warm light over the battered farm, Lucan stood in the barnyard, his father by his side. Ariadne approached, her rifle slung over her shoulder and a weary smile on her face. "You okay?" she asked. Lucan nodded. "Yeah, thanks to you." She shrugged. "Couldn't let you have all the fun." For the first time in what felt like forever, Lucan allowed himself a small smile. The fight was over, but the scars it left would take time to heal. Still, as he looked out over the fields and the community that had come together in his defense, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. The aftermath of the battle left the farm in a state of uneasy calm. The Crimson Hounds had been dismantled, their leader and core members either in custody or fleeing town to avoid capture. Sheriff Martin's deputies continued their investigation, gathering evidence from the wreckage of the barn and the gang's hideout to ensure that Declan Forrester and his crew faced the full weight of the law. Lucan Traynor, however, wasn't basking in victory. As the morning sun bathed the farm in golden light, he stood by the porch, surveying the damage. The barn would need to be rebuilt, fences mended, and the scars of the fight cleaned away. But the physical toll wasn't what weighed on him the most. The events of the past week had stirred memories he'd worked hard to bury, and the fight had left him questioning whether he could ever truly escape the shadow of his past. Charles Traynor joined him, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand. "Looks like we've got our work cut out for us," Charles said, his tone light, but with an undercurrent of concern. Lucan nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We'll get it done. We always do." Charles placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Lucan. You stood your ground and protected what's ours. That's all any man can do." Lucan managed a faint smile. "Thanks, Dad." A familiar truck rumbled up the dirt road. Its arrival stirred a puff of dust in its wake. Ariadne Carrick stepped out, her rifle still slung over her shoulder. Though her demeanor was more relaxed, she offered Lucan a small wave as she approached. "Thought you could use some help," she said, gesturing to the supplies in the back of her truck, lumber, nails, and tools. "Figured we'd start with the barn." Lucan raised an eyebrow. "Didn't realize you were in the construction business." "I'm not," Ariadne admitted with a grin. "But I know how to follow instructions." Charles chuckled. "Well, we won't turn down an extra pair of hands." As the day progressed, the trio worked side by side, clearing debris and laying the groundwork for rebuilding. Neighbors began to trickle in, some bringing tools and materials, others simply offering moral support. It was a reminder of the resilience and camaraderie that defined Millhaven, a community that, despite its struggles, always came together in times of need. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the fields, the framework of the new barn was beginning to take shape. Lucan stood back, wiping sweat from his brow as he surveyed their progress. It wasn't much yet, but it was a start. Ariadne approached, handing him a bottle of water. "Not bad for a day's work," she said, her tone teasing. Lucan took a sip, nodding in agreement. "Couldn't have done it without you." Ariadne shrugged. "You'd have figured it out? You always do." The comfortable silence that settled between them was broken by the sound of approaching footsteps. Sheriff Martin had returned, his expression serious but not unkind. "Traynor," he said, nodding and greeting. "Got some news you'll want to hear." Lucan tensed slightly, his instincts on high alert. "What's going on?" Martin glanced at Ariadne, then back to Lucan. "Declan's spilling everything. Names, operations, the whole 9 yards. Turns out the Crimson Hounds weren't just a small-town gang. They were part of a much larger network." Lucan's jaw tightened. "How much larger?" "Big enough that it's going to take some time to sort through it all," Martin admitted. "But the good news is, you've made a dent. A big one." Ariadne crossed her arms, her brow furrowing. "And the bad news?" Martin hesitated. "Declan's connections run deep. There are people out there who won't be happy about what you've done here. People with resources and reach." Lucan nodded, his expression unreadable. "Let them come. I'll be ready." Martin sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Just watch your back, all right? You've made some enemies." As the sheriff left, the weight of his words lingered in the air. Lucan knew he couldn't afford to let his guard down, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose. The fight wasn't over, but it was a fight he was willing to face. Later that night, as the farm settled into silence, Lucan found himself sitting on the porch, the cool night air a welcome reprieve from the day's labor. Ariadne joined him, a glass of lemonade in hand. "Are you thinking about what Martin said?" she asked, breaking the silence. Lucan nodded. "Hard not to. But this is my home. I'm not running." "Didn't think you would," Ariadne said with a small smile. "But you don't have to do it alone, you know." Lucan glanced at her, his expression softening. "Thanks, Ariadne, for everything." She shrugged, though her smile grew wider. "Anytime." As the stars blinked into view above them, Lucan felt a rare sense of peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he wasn't walking it alone, and for now, that was enough. The following morning was calm, the kind of peaceful start that had once defined life on the Trainer farm. The rebuilding efforts continued, but now it wasn't just Lucan, Ariadne, and Charles. Half the town seemed to have turned up, each person bringing tools, supplies, and stories of their own. It was a testament to the unity of Millhaven, a community coming together in the aftermath of the chaos brought by the Crimson Hounds. Lucan found himself at the center of it all, not just as the one who had stood up to Declan Forrester, but as a symbol of resilience. People who had been too afraid to challenge the gang before now looked to him with newfound respect, their quiet gratitude shining through in the way they worked beside him. Ariadne appeared beside him, brushing sawdust from her hands. "You're turning into a local hero, you know." Lucan shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I'm just trying to keep this place standing." "Yeah, well, you've done more than that," Ariadne said, her tone sincere. "You gave people hope. That's no small thing." Lucan didn't respond, but her words lingered. For years he had thought of himself as a soldier, someone trained to fight battles that weren't his own. Yet here, on his family's land, he had found a battle worth fighting, a fight not just for his home but for the people who called Millhaven home too. By the time the barn was fully rebuilt, the farm felt like it had regained some of its former vitality. The once charred skeleton of the structure now stood tall and strong, a testament to the collective effort of the community. As the last nail was hammered in, a cheer went up from the gathered crowd, their laughter and applause filling the air. Charles Trainer stood beside his son, his expression filled with pride. "Your mother would have loved this," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Seeing everyone come together like this." Lucan nodded, his throat tightening. "She would have been out here bossing everyone around." Charles chuckled, the sound bittersweet. "That she would." As the crowd began to disperse, offering their final words of encouragement and promises to visit soon, Ariadne lingered. She leaned against the barn door, her arms crossed as she watched Lucan with a thoughtful expression. "You okay?" she asked. Lucan nodded. "Yeah, for the first time in a while I think I am." But peace in Millhaven was never guaranteed. A week after the barn was finished, Lucan received an unexpected visitor. Sheriff Martin arrived at the farm, his cruiser kicking up dust as it rolled down the driveway. The look on his face told Lucan everything he needed to know. Trouble was brewing again. "What is it this time?" Lucan asked as Martin stepped out of the car. Martin handed him a folded piece of paper. "This came in this morning. Declan's people aren't happy about what happened here. They've put out a word that anyone tied to you is fair game." Lucan unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the crude note. It was a thinly veiled threat, warning of retaliation against Millhaven and anyone who had stood with him. His jaw tightened as he folded the note back up. "They're bluffing," Lucan said, though he didn't entirely believe it. "Maybe," Martin replied, "but I wouldn't count on it. These kinds of people don't like to lose." Lucan exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had thought the fight was over, but it seemed that the Crimson Hound's reach extended further than he had imagined. That evening, Lucan called a meeting with Ariadne and a few trusted neighbors. They gathered in the newly rebuilt barn, the air thick with tension as they discussed their options. "We can't let them intimidate us," Ariadne said firmly. "If we back down now, they'll think they can walk all over us." "She's right," said one of the neighbors, an older man named Hank. "But we're not soldiers, Lucan. We can't fight them the way you can." Lucan leaned against the wall, His arms crossed as he listened. "We're not going to fight them head on," he said. "That's what they want. But we can make it clear that Millhaven isn't an easy target." Over the next few days, Lucan worked with the community to fortify their defenses. They installed floodlights around the town's perimeter, set up cameras to monitor activity, and organized patrols to keep watch at night. It wasn't much, but it was enough to send a message. Millhaven wasn't going to roll over. The retaliation came in the form of a small group of outsiders, hired muscles sent by the remnants of the Crimson Hounds. They arrived in the dead of night, their dark SUVs creeping into town with the intent of catching Millhaven off guard. But Lucan and his team were ready. As the intruders attempted to break into the general store, floodlights snapped on, illuminating the street like a stage. Lucan stepped out from the shadows, his shotgun held steady in his hands. Beside him stood Ariadne, her rifle aimed with deadly precision. "This is private property," Lucan called out, his voice calm but commanding. "You've got 5 seconds to turn around and leave." The intruders hesitated, their confidence faltering under the scrutiny of the lights and the armed townsfolk who began to emerge from their homes. They had expected an easy target, not a coordinated response. One of them, a tall man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward. "You think you can scare us? We've handled worse than a bunch of farmers with guns." Lucan's eyes didn't waver. "Try me." For a moment it seemed like the intruders might push their luck, but the sight of the townsfolk standing united, their determination evident in every face, was enough to make them think twice. They retreated to their vehicles, their engines roaring as they sped away into the night. As the dust settled, the townspeople gathered in the square, their relief palpable. Lucan stood at the center, his presence a quiet reassurance to those around him. "They won't be back," he said, his voice steady. "Not if we stick together." Ariadne stepped forward, her eyes meeting his. "You saved this town, Lucan. Don't downplay that." Lucan shook his head. "We saved it. Together." As the crowd dispersed, Lucan felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Charles, his father's face lined with pride and gratitude. "Your mother would have been proud," Charles said softly. Lucan smiled. "I hope so." As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Millhaven stood stronger than ever. The scars of the past weeks would take time to heal, but the town had proven that it wouldn't be broken. And for Lucan, the farm had become more than just a home. It was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the face of darkness, there was always a reason to fight. And so, the story of Lucan Trainer and the battle for Millhaven comes to a close, leaving us with powerful lessons about resilience, courage, and the strength of community. When faced with overwhelming odds, Lucan stood firm, not just for himself, but for his family and the town he called home. It's a testament to how, even in the darkest moments, unity and determination can light the way. What do you think about Lucan's journey? Did his unwavering resolve inspire you? Let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on the story, your favorite moments, or even how it made you reflect on challenges in your own life. Your insights are what make this channel a community worth sharing. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to give it a big thumbs up, share it with someone who loves a tale of triumph, and most importantly, hit that subscribe button to join the Heart Tales family. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss another story that stirs your soul and warms your heart. Thank you for being part of this journey. Stay tuned for more stories that remind us of the power of the human spirit. Until next time, take care, and we'll see you in the next tale from the heart.